Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on Lessons Learned in CPACE Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Project Development. My name is Brian Bursteiner, Director of Technical Support Services for Sustainable Real Estate Solutions, SRS, and I'll be monitoring today's program, which is sponsored by the Connecticut Green Bank, or CGB, and SRS. Our presenters today are Mackie Dykes, CGB's Vice President of Commercial and Industrial Programs and Director of the CPACE program, and Anthony Bonacore, SRS Director of Engineering. Anthony is a licensed professional engineer and has been involved with property-related energy work for almost 45 years. The presentation today will focus on the technical lessons learned in reviewing CPACE projects in Connecticut over the last 2 years. The Connecticut Green Bank's CPACE program is widely regarded as the most successful commercial PACE program in the country. Since launching in 2013, the program has financed more than 115 projects valued at almost $100 million, created almost 1,000 jobs, and saved building owners almost $250 million in energy costs. Much of this success is due to the commitment and enthusiasm of contractors who are the driving force behind the growth and success of the program. To build on this momentum, Anthony's presentation will focus on the most common shortcomings encountered in project technical review of both ECM and solar PV projects. The presentation is designed to help energy consultants, HVAC service and construction firms, and solar contractors avoid pitfalls and expedite projects through the technical review process. For the webinar today, we have allocated 45 minutes for the presentation and 15 minutes for Q&A. For those of you who submitted questions when you registered, thank you very much. We plan to cover those questions as well as those submitted during today's program via the GoToWebinar toolbar. And we encourage you to submit questions. Now, without further delay, I will ask Mackie Dykes to provide some CPACE program introductory remarks.
Thanks, Brian. This is Mackie Dykes. As Brian said, I'm the still relatively new Vice President of Commercial and Industrial Programs here at the Connecticut Green Bank. I want to thank everyone for joining on this first webinar of a series. We've got a great turnout, what we hope will be a successful effort. We're going to focus on, well, Brian talked about the focus today, but the overall series will focus on topics that you suggest and areas of interest that we see developing throughout the program. So hopefully this will be a great tool for all of us to connect and share best practices and learnings from the field. Before I turn it over to Anthony, just want to remind everyone about our Energy on the Line program, which we have going on right now. This is a program which gives grants of up to $50,000 to manufacturers who do a CPACE project. So we have a website, energyontheline.com, where you can learn more, or of course, reach out to any of us here at the Green Bank. We'd love to work with you all on a manufacturing project. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Brian and Anthony Bonacore to lead us through the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mackie, very much for that introduction. At this time, I'll hand things over to Anthony for his presentation.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning to all of you. Many of you have requested that we put on a webinar focusing on the lessons learned in the CPACE technical review process so that all of us can become more efficient in dealing with this process. I believe you'll find that this first webinar is designed to do just that. My presentation over the next 30 to 45 minutes, let me make sure I get this working. Okay. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes is divided into 3 parts, as you can see in the slide. As a background, I do want to say a few words about why technical review is part of the CPACE process and what its objective is. Then I'm going to get into the meat of the presentation and discuss the lessons learned in technically reviewing project submissions for both ECM and solar PV projects. These lessons learned kind of represent the most common issues, shortcomings that we found in project submissions. And then I'll wrap up and say a few words with how contractors can help us, and we can expedite the whole technical review process. Okay, there have been some who have certainly questioned the benefit of having third-party technical review, particularly because the PACE loan is a priority lien, meaning that it stands in line behind, in front of the mortgage. It's understandable. Such questioning can be understandable from a capital provider viewpoint, certainly who have the safety of a priority lien. But clearly, it's not applicable for the building owner and the mortgage holder. Virtually every survey that we've ever seen, which was sought to identify the barriers to energy efficiency investment, identified as a major barrier, that lack of confidence in the energy savings projections. And it's understandable, and I think partly because there is a perceived, certainly by building owners, an inherent bias that may exist on the part of energy auditors and energy service companies, and I think also because, unfortunately, energy savings can't be measured. So the idea that third-party review is part of the process, what it does is it can provide a level of confidence that the project at least has been vetted by another party. Okay. The benefit to contractors clearly is an improved bottom line because you're able to increase your business. And I think that's because you're able to provide the often skeptical building owner with validation by a third party that the energy savings and the cash flow projections have been reviewed by an independent party. The end result, clearly, of this type of validation can present a sales advantage, a competitive advantage, a differentiator for your business. And it also should improve your proposal to project conversion rate, which ultimately will increase your business and ultimately increase the bottom line. So yeah, there are distinct benefits and advantages to building owners and contractors in having this third-party review. Okay, what does the review focus on? As you can see here in red, it all comes down to the magic SIR, the savings to investment ratio. I'm sure most of you are intimately familiar with it. This, as many of you know, is a legislative mandate that the savings to investment ratio for the project must be greater than 1. And the understanding is that we're looking at the projected savings, not just in the first year, but over the entire lifetime of the project. It takes into account everything from utility incentives right through tax incentives, whatever there are. We're looking at that total savings, and then what we're doing is looking at the total investment. And as you can see here, the total investment comprises not just capital cost and one-time utility rebates, but also things such as any upfront costs you as a contractor might have, perhaps for the energy audit, perhaps for the solar feasibility study, etc. It can also include any energy conservation measure or renewable energy costs or related costs related to implementation or installation of those measures. So, for example, it might include a new roof as part of a solar PV project, or it might include perhaps asbestos removal as part of a new boiler installation. All of the financing costs, from closing fees, interest payments, what have you, are all factored into the I. And so the whole goal of the technical review by CPACE is to evaluate the S, the savings, evaluate the I, the investment, and try to get that SIR, or make sure that SIR meets the legislative mandate of being greater than 1. Okay, now if we get to this whole SIR validation process, and we kind of break it down into the key elements. I've kind of put here the key elements, divided them, laid them out. the things that are looked at. And as you can see here, they begin with utility bills, follow through to coming up with the energy conservation measures, making sure they're eligible, coming up with the savings, and then working your way right through to that SIR where we're evaluating whether the SIR is greater than 1. What I plan to do is take the lessons learned for both ECM projects, and I'll deal with those first, and then with solar PV projects, and I'll deal with that second. And as I go through the lessons learned, I'll divide them into or categorize them by the key project elements that you see in this slide. And clearly I'm going to be combining some of them. Okay, let's begin with the lessons learned, from the submittals related to ECMs. Under the utility bill element, I think it's become pretty clear to us, and I think to most of the contractors we routinely deal with, that it's necessary to take a look at the detailed utility bills in whatever baseline period you're dealing with. You've got to understand the rate breakdown for the tariff that's being used by the property owner, and not only in the baseline period, but also what the most current tariffs are. We all know that the utilities change these or can change these every 6 months, typically on January 1st and July 1st. And I think most of us know or are familiar with that last major change made just about a year ago, last July 1st, when the utilities decided to shift the allocation of costs for a significant portion, at least to us, from the generation side to the demand delivery side. In any event, having knowledge of these actual tariffs details is important, again, from both the generation side as well as demand and delivery. If you have, for example, ECMs, that may not reduce demand. Maybe like to setback controls, for low occupancy periods. Clearly, you're dealing with something that can impact the kilowatt hours, but it's not going to impact the peak demand. So clearly, when you're looking at the savings, you're dealing with the kilowatt hour savings, the generation savings, not any impact on demand. Then, of course, we have the possibility of using a blended rate, which kind of blends the rates associated with generation as well as those with demand and delivery. And those can be used for certain types of ECMs, for example, lighting, where the kilowatt hours and the kilowatt reductions, those savings are coincident, so it may be acceptable there. So clearly, the issue of the old days, perhaps just taking a blended rate and using that all by itself, those clearly have gone by the wayside. The same, by the way, is true with natural gas, no different. They are both the supplier charges as well as those demand delivery charges. One thing that we have not seen a lot of attention given to, but I would just refer you to it. When you take a look at the bills, don't forget that there is such thing as a ratchet provision. This ratchet provision exists for both electricity and gas. So, for example, if you perhaps are looking at the utilities electric rate, and I'll just pick off the top of my head rate 35, which I see so often, the distribution demand is defined as the highest average 30-minute kilowatt demand in the current month, or, this is the ratchet kicking in, the preceding 11 months. And again, assuming there is no agreement otherwise with the utility, even if you have a reduction in demand when the ECMs are installed, the owner can be billed for the highest kilowatt demand from the previous 11 months. Hence, there could be an 11-month catch-up period for this ratchet. So pay attention to that depending upon the rate structure that you might be in. We've also seen contractors on the fuel side use straight daily averaging for fuel oil, which I think many of us know now that can be very misleading. We've always suggested that you try to get a feel for the non-weather related fuel oil use, perhaps by looking at its use in the summer months, and putting that separately, that stays relatively constant. And then at least the remainder, if you're going to allocate it, you can use heating degree days. Under the, I go to the next slide, under the baseline key element, which you'll see here in the slide, probably the most prevalent issue that we get into discussions with contractors on is related to, quote unquote, is it representative? Clearly, we have seen baseline periods that are less than a year. We need at least a year for a baseline period to be considered representative. We try to make sure and question that there are no major renovations that took place during the baseline period. So obviously, if a data center was put in the middle of the baseline period, that's going to really screw up your baseline. We try to make sure that that's taken down, and certainly please take a look at that. We take a look at building occupancy, significant changes there or non-typical changes there. Any kind of building operating hour change, you try to get those out so you can come up with a relatively representative baseline. If in the middle of the baseline period, I don't know, a lighting upgrade was done, obviously that's going to impact it. So clearly the intent is try to get the most representative baseline period. If that's off, clearly so much else can be off when you calculate and determine the savings. Also, it does certainly make sense that when you do your baseline period and you get baseline numbers, certainly normalize them. Whether normalization should be done. If you don't do it, certainly it can make a difference, so we highly request that you do that. With respect to the recommended ECMs, which typically come out of the energy audit that's conducted, the most common thing that we've seen is ineligible ECMs used. Now, they may be appropriate for a building, but from the standpoint of CPACE financing, they may represent a problem. For example, ECMs that are not permanently fixed. The legislative requirement is that they be permanently affixed, which is interpreted as very difficult to remove. So, for example, while window shades, certainly can reduce energy costs, they are removable, and hence they're considered ineligible, as are most of the Energy Star appliances, which can be removed. Also, from the standpoint of maintenance savings, we do see maintenance savings commonly included. We cannot consider maintenance savings that can't be fully documented, both before ECMs and what's going to happen after. They must be documented with real documentation that supports whatever savings are out there. Also, we have seen countless times where the energy audit has a whole series of recommended ECMs, and then lo and behold, it gets to the property owner, and for whatever reason, they have their own financial criteria. Perhaps they didn't even discuss it with the contractor, and they decide, well, we don't really want to do the project consisting of all these ECMs. We only want this portion. Again, strongly suggest that you get a pretty good feel up front as to what the criteria for success are for proceeding with a project, and understand if a building owner does have cash flow limitations or NPV limitations, make sure you're well aware of those. Finally, I think most of us know it's relatively easy to do a CPACE project when we're replacing equipment. The building owner has to have the piece of equipment. He's got to have the air conditioning, and if it's existing air conditioning is falling off the roof, it's beyond its useful life, what have you. Certainly, it's easily able for a building owner to immediately want you to replace that air conditioning. What we would strongly suggest, to the extent that you're able to do this, is don't ignore the many other energy-saving opportunities that could be part of the project, rather than just doing that one. It does make for a larger project, and what we're looking for is trying to get the maximum savings that we can get. With respect to the estimated useful life, this has become very important over the last probably 6 months or so, because as many of you know, we have started looking at the savings. We originally started looking at energy savings over the finance term, if you recall. Now, the CPACE program permits looking at the energy savings over the full estimated useful life of these ECMs, which means the estimated useful life becomes really important, and of course it means that to the extent that you get a greater use, longer period of time for your estimated useful life. You got more savings, and it helps your SIR. For the record, we have a fairly significant database which you have access to try to keep up to speed on estimated useful lives that are based on good industry practice. You see some of the information and the data sources here. We do watch that. We have seen, for example, perhaps on LED projects, people trying to get in on 20 years. Ain't going to happen. If you do want to go above an EUL that exceeds the industry norm, we're not saying you can't do it. You just got to provide some fairly good documentation. We've also seen projects where like LED lighting, where substantial changes have been made and progress has been made over the last few years in terms of the operating hours. You can see here in the slide that, maybe 50,000 hours was something you saw in the past just a couple of years ago. Now 100,000 hours is becoming more the norm. So anyway, trying to keep up to date with them, it can help you certainly in the SIR calculation, and it is something that we take a close look at. Probably the most important thing is as my guess is you can imagine in terms of what we take a look at are the energy savings projections. And here the thing that matters very strongly to us is when you do your energy savings analysis, you're going to look at a baseline under normalized conditions, and this is without ECMs. And then when you add the ECMs, those are evaluated under the normalized conditions. So you're looking at energy savings on an apples-to-apples basis. I can't tell you how many projects we've seen where we've seen the projections for energy savings with ECMs based on normalized conditions, and we've seen that compared to an actual baseline number, which again is an apple to orange. So pay particular attention to that. We have seen building energy use model spreadsheets used. It's not unusual. Be very, very cognizant when you run these things of what the building shape looks like, because we've seen oversimplification of building shapes, which can have a fairly significant impact on energy costs, as many of you know. We've also seen so easy, there are defaults in the models, and it's so easy just to rely on them, which have a whole series of assumptions attached to them. Pay attention to that. You don't want to default to everything. You want to be as close to what's actually there as possible. When you calibrate the model, preferably calibrating it against the actual utility data. We have seen, when you do the calibration and you got to do the tweaking, some arbitrary tweaking that's being done to make the model work or quote-unquote look good. We do take a look at that, but pay attention to that. And clearly, as you use all models, doesn't matter. It is a model, and there's uncertainty involved, and certainly be aware of what that uncertainty is. And it would be very helpful, in the basis of the model that uncertainty is clarified. With respect to interactive effects, models, of course, those building simulation models take them into account. Some of the, when you're running spreadsheets perhaps on individual ECMs, they may not take it into account. We do look at them. They're not generally overpowering, these interactive effects. But, certainly, if you're putting in high efficiency lighting, you can increase the air conditioning load in the summer and, decrease the air conditioning load in the summer and increase the heating load in the wintertime. We do take a look at the savings projections over the estimated useful life. Since you are allowed to look at those savings over the EUL, clearly, the question of energy cost escalations come into play. We do take a look at that. In Connecticut, we do not allow energy cost escalations above 3%. So you can escalate electricity by 3%. You can escalate fuel by 3%. At this stage of the game, that's where we stand. The other thing is no equipment operates the way it was initially put in forever. There is performance degradation, and we do suggest that you take a look at what type of annual performance degradation you want to incorporate. It's not unusual for us to, if you don't put anything in, to factor in somewhere in that 0.5% to 1% area. As you can see here, and as I said before, while many of these new ECMs can result in less maintenance, which is obviously cost savings, unless they can be really documented well. particularly prior to ECMs being installed. We can't accept those in the SIR analysis. As many of you know, yeah, lighting can certainly save, quote unquote, maintenance, particularly if you're replacing it, the lighting at a less of a frequency. But in many cases, certainly in the building sector that we all operate in, maybe 10,000 to 100,000 or so square feet, maintenance people aren't going to be let go because of that. They're just going to be doing something else. So the idea of documentation becomes very important. Otherwise, just, that's kind of a bonus that the property owner would receive. Finally, if there are utility rebates that are available, we highly suggest you include them. Even if you don't have an agreement with the utility yet, you certainly can provide an estimate. All I'd ask is make it a reasonable estimate, and we have a lot of those numbers, so if you need some help on that, let us know. Finally, with respect to project costs, probably the biggest thing that we've seen is you're not including things that should be done or that have to be done as part of the ECM installation. And I put one of them here, which was very classic, and that's related to boiler conversions. You're going to do a fuel switch. You're going to go from fuel oil to natural gas. As you all know, that means that I no longer need my fuel oil tank. And it costs money to remove a fuel oil tank. There may be some releases of fuel oil that have to be cleaned up. If I'm redoing the utility room, there may be asbestos removal on the piping. All of that type of stuff is covered under CPACE, but it should be part of the project since you can't. So it is going to be a cost that's incurred, and it's directly associated with the ECM. So make sure you pay particular attention to that. The other thing, too, is we have seen a number of cases where people took non-ECM related costs. In other words, these are costs that weren't directly related in any way to the ECM being installed, and they threw them into the project. And we've seen, for example, entire building rewiring that not even associated with ECMs being included or trying to be included. We'll watch for that. We've seen where building envelope repairs having nothing to do with ECMs have been included. So again, we try to be sensitive to that. We ask that you would be sensitive to that. They certainly can be part of the project. It's just whether they're financeable under CPACE becomes an issue and something that we have to talk about. The only other thing that I would mention here is related to documentation and the importance of documentation supporting, the project, that it be available. We like to see the cut sheets, certainly, because clearly that's what's being installed. And when commissioning oversight is done by us after the installation, perhaps because there's a holdback on the project, we have to confirm for the capital provider that this is what was paid for and this is what actually was installed. Many of you also know that certainly there may be even performance certificates from the AHRI related to confirmation of SEERs and other things. We like to see the cost proposals, contracts supporting the project costs, so we have a high degree of confidence that this is going to be the project costs and that there aren't hopefully going to be many surprises. If there are equipment warranties, we would like to see those, to be included. Certainly, you're going to have to get those together anyway for the property owner. And how you're going to commission the system doesn't have to be an elaborate plan, but saying a few words about it would be especially helpful. We do have our technical review team here has some templates, so if you are interested, we certainly can provide those to you and help you with that. Okay, next, that were with ECM. Let me deal now with the lessons learned from contractor submittals on solar PV projects. Okay, again, just as with ECMs, you can see here the areas that we focus on. You see that word solar feasibility study, and that's probably one of the big things, but it's many of the same areas, and I'm going to try to deal with this in exactly the same way we dealt with the ECM key elements. I'll try to divide the lessons learned by the principal key elements. Okay, utility bills. Probably the most common shortcoming we've seen here is that the most current electric rates were not used. or even using that blended rate I referred to when I talked about ECMs for electricity. Remember, all that we can give credit for is on the generation side, not the demand delivery side. Unfortunately today, no credit can be taken for demand reduction. There just really isn't sufficient data to justify it. Now, of course, if you have a battery storage system or some other energy storage system, that changes everything, but most of you are not doing that because of the cost implications. So in any event, we really are focusing just on the generation charge. And as you know, it becomes difficult as the utilities have cut the generation charge and basically moved some of the expenses to the demand delivery side. It's hurt certainly solar systems. I think many solar contractors, many of you were taken by surprise when the utility did that last summer, but it just made it more difficult for solar projects. The thing to point out certainly is that these demand delivery charges kick in any month, where just for a mere 30 minutes, for whatever reason, the solar system is not producing electricity. Clearly, we know it's not producing electricity when the sun ain't shining, at night. And during the day, it may not be, depending upon bad weather. And I never forget the calls we received back in the winter of 2015. If you recall, we had that huge amount of snow. And the impact on kilowatt hours being produced by the solar systems was absolutely devastating. We were looking at the locust monitors, and we're just shocked at how everything basically went to almost zero. And of course, that didn't matter to many building owners who still complained because they didn't understand the limitation. In any event, utility bill is important, and right now focusing on the generation side. Baseline energy consumption has pretty much the same issues as I talked about related to ECMs. Just make sure that that baseline period truly is representative. One difference, though, that I would point out is that, as compared to ECMs, for example, is that if you are, because of what the utility's done and reduce the generation side, the generation charge, the kilowatt-hour charges, okay? We've seen many of the solar companies now combining ECMs, such as, for example, lighting, okay, which has a very, very short payback period. It's good to combine it with solar. It helps to justify the entire project. That makes sense, and it makes sense to do, but clearly, if you're going to look at sizing the solar system, make sure that you reduce the kilowatt hours by the lighting ECM installation that's going to be installed. Otherwise, as you probably know, you're going to oversize the system, and if the system is producing more electricity than the building needs, it goes to the grid, but it's a wholesale price issue as opposed to an offset retail price. So keep that in the back of your mind. On the feasibility side, I know when we initially started the program, we did get a number of feasibility studies that just totally ignored the shading. Now that's a rare occurrence, so I don't want to really spend much time on it. I do want to say a few words about some of the other elements which are extremely important. Routinely, we find these feasibility studies for rooftop systems, and they don't provide any opinion on the remaining useful life of the roof. We want to be sure that's going to last as long as the EUL of the solar PV system, certainly at a minimum the length of the financing term, depending upon what's used for determination of the savings. So clearly pay attention to that. Also often we see issues related to the inverter life. As many of you know, the string inverters don't have they're not going to give you a 20-year life, a 25-year life. So you need an extended warranty, and that extended warranty costs money. It's financeable in the CPACE program, but make sure that those dollars are incorporated into the project. And clearly they have to be there. So something for you to think about. I would also suggest you start thinking a little bit about, if you haven't already, the microinverters, because I'm actually seeing warranties for 20 years on that. I think it's fast approaching the EUL of the solar PV system. So it's something to think about. They may be a little bit more expensive, but it may be a little bit better of a savings compared to using an extended warranty for the string inverters. So again, keep it in the back of your mind. Another shortcoming certainly is related to the fact that you are putting a solar system on a roof. There are wind and snow loadings that have to be evaluated against whatever the roof structure looks like. And what we typically like to see, as many of you know now, is a structural engineer's professional opinion with respect to it being able to handle not just the loading of the solar system, but the snow, wind, and there's other design loads that have to be factored in. We do look at the PV model. I know many people think you submit the PV model and that's gospel. As many of you know, there are assumptions that are put into that. We do look at the system losses that you put in, as well as the inverter efficiencies. Generally, if you're, I think we typically will accept anywhere in that 10 to 15% area for system losses. And as we get more and more MFE data, we're paying attention to that to try to get a better feel for it. But clearly, if you're going to put system losses at less than 10%, it's going to be something that we flag. Same is going to be true with respect to inverter efficiencies. If the inverter efficiencies are too high, as you can see here, it's going to be something that we'll flag and take a closer look at. Not that, again, that we're going to throw something out, but certainly if there's documentation to support it, we're happy to do that. One last thing that I would note, we have seen this a couple of times, is remember when you use that PV watts, we don't have a huge number of stations in Connecticut where there's solar irradiation data, as many of you know. And we do take a look to try to at least have some degree of confidence that whatever station the solar irradiation is being taken from, that it's representative of wherever the solar PV system is actually going to be located. So clearly, the case that we saw was Hartford data actually used for a coastal location, and that's something that represents a problem that we'd question it, and we'd have to try to figure out how to deal with that. And there are ways to deal with it. We also like to see in the PV assessment fire marshal approval. As many of you know now, it's something that is at the attention, in the attention span of these fire marshals. They are concerned about it. The electrical codes have now dealt with it. They want a certain amount of access, etc. All I'd suggest is talk to the fire marshal beforehand. We've actually had a number of projects where the fire marshal was talked at later and the whole layout of the system had to be modified and reconfigured, which just wastes a lot of time. So the earlier you can do that, the better. Make sure that you include some kind of performance degradation for your annual performance degradation for your system. We typically see between 0.5% and 1%. Clearly, if you're going to use less than 0.5%, or you don't even include an annual performance degradation figure, we're going to put something in there. So at least 0.5% to 1%, somewhere in that range. With respect to energy savings projections, the biggest, of course, is making sure that it is based on the generation dollars per kilowatt, nothing else. We're going to need to see the LOA, certainly before any kind of financing could take place from the utility for the ZRECs. And don't forget, there are dates, key dates in the ZREC LOA, and if the solar PV system is delayed extensively, it's something, again, that can impact the savings, the ZREC savings, and we'll take a look at that. So keep that in the back of your mind. There may be uncertainty surrounding electrical production, which I think clearly most of you who are solar contractors know that. The problem, of course, is that many times the property owner you're dealing with really doesn't understand that. They see your projections and they think automatically they're going to get it, and if they don't get it, they start calling us as to why am I not getting it. Anything you can do clearly to make it clear in the feasibility study, in the documentation, that these costs are predicated on long-term average solar irradiation data. They can vary daily, they can vary weekly and monthly. Over the long term, it makes sense, but in any very, very short period of time, it may not. So any you can do that to manage client expectations would certainly be helpful. Again, we have the same issues with respect to what are you dealing with on your savings when you project them over the EUL. We got that cost escalation, and again, 3% for electricity. Not more. We've seen 4s and 5s, but stay with the 3 at this point in time. And again, include that performance degradation, as I indicated before. We've seen unsubstantiated tax rates used when bonus depreciation and the makers is applied. Try to get something as close as possible, because we will consider that in the savings, but it certainly should be reasonable. And again, if you're going to apply if you're going to have this excess electricity, in other words, you're going to send more to the grid than the building needs over the long term, remember that's at the wholesale rate, which is fairly cheap compared to the retail rate. So keep that in the back of your mind. On the cost side, probably the biggies are related to which I think most of you are aware of. You certainly want to make sure that the roof, if it needs to be upgraded, it is, and that of course will be covered by the CPACE loan. Same as building structural support that might be needed. We have seen, again, the same as we saw with regular ECMs, other non-solar related costs included, rewiring buildings, building envelope repairs. Again, they've got to be related to the solar system, so pay particular attention to that. Make sure that extended warranty and whatever the cost of the extended warranty is in there, depending on the type of inverters that you use. We want to make sure that the inverters costing, whatever it is, whether that be replacement cost, whatever, that those are taken care of over the term that you use to evaluate the savings in the SIR. Those two have to be consistent. Also, when you do your ITC, remember the IRS has a whole bunch of what's allowable in the ITC. Things like the roof upgrade is not. Make sure that that's not in there. Otherwise, we'll have to take it out. And then, just as with the regular ECMs, we do pay attention to documentation to the extent that things can be documented. It is extremely helpful. We love to see the cut sheets. Again, for the same reasons, we like to see them with ECMs. Warranties, cost proposals, things of that nature, all very helpful. CX plans, the commissioning plans, your M&V plan on the solar side, no big deal, but a short write-up is needed. We want to make sure that's that's submitted to us. If you need help with it, we do have templates again that we can share with you, and many of you I know use those already. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping up. Let me wrap up with the one last slide that I just want to say a few words about what you can do to expedite the process. I think everything that I've been talking about, if you pay attention to those things, and many of you do, clearly, what it does is it just expedites the whole CPACE technical review process. And the other thing is there's a whole team here to work with you that can support what you're doing by doing a lot of work and kind of bringing a project in at the 11th hour. If there are issues, it just delays everything. So I would highly suggest you begin working with the CPACE technical team as early as possible in the project. And ultimately what you do is want to get a project submittal that has all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and all of the types of things that you see, bullets there, are all taken into consideration. And certainly the whole CPACE technical team is here available. There's no cost to you, but they'll work with you and support you where needed, both from a detailed engineering side to any other assistance that you might need with a building on. So that's about it. I think now we can probably move to questions and answers, Brian, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony, for the presentation. That concludes our formal presentations. A number of questions were submitted during the webinar. So we'll dive right in here and ask Mackie and Anthony for the answers. Okay. Question, can you explain the ratchet provision you referred to when you spoke about energy savings projections?
Yeah, I guess I didn't speak too much about it, but I guess it's best illustrated if you take a look at a utility rate example. And let me just grab one of these. The most common bill that I see is from Eversource under their rate 35, which is, the building's maximum demand is less than 200 kilowatts. There's a distribution demand ratchet provision, okay? And what that provision does say is that the distribution demand, and I think I mentioned this in the presentation, is the highest average 30-minute kilowatt demand in the current month or the highest in the preceding 11 months. That's the ratchet. And so what it means, for example, is that you may have ECMs that are installed that they will reduce the kilowatt demand, but it may not be reflected in the current utility bill because the highest average 30-minute kilowatt demand may not be in the current month, but it may have been something that's in the preceding 11 months. So again, and you'll see that on the utility bill because you'll see the actual demand used in the deciding what the costs are going to be. But you'll also see the highest in the preceding 11 months, which may be different than what the actual demand was for that month. So again, pay attention. We do many times, at least I've seen on God knows how many of these bills, they have a service account message, and in that message they'll indicate that distribution demand was based on that ratchet. So again, keep an eye on that, which means it could take up as much as 11 months, unless you can work something out with the utility. God bless you, to reflect the demand savings. I would note too, we have had projects, CHP projects, where the property owner actually can get a distribution generation, we call it a DG rider, and that can waive the distribution demand ratchet provision. So again, if you do have on-site generation with CHP, for example, that is something that could be waived. Don't ignore that because that can save you a pretty penny, especially with that shift in costs moving from the generation side to heavily from the generation side to the demand delivery side. And I think I mentioned it in the presentation, Brian, that there's also a ratchet provision on the natural gas side. And again, the only difference that I recall is that it's the highest daily usage during the current month or the highest daily usage during a winter period, which I believe they define as November to March in the most recent 11 months prior to the current billing period, which is the ratchet. So again, you have it in both cases. And I believe also that the gas company, Yankee Gas, for example, they also have that distributed generation delivery rebate that can deal with that. So again, pay attention to it, particularly if you have these CHP systems. Brian?
Okay, thanks. Maintenance. Why can't maintenance savings be included in the SIR calculation?
Yeah, God knows how. That's a good question. We keep getting asked that. The bottom line is that I think many of you know they're difficult to document. That's what we've seen. Documenting and tracking them, particularly prior to you getting involved, prior to any energy audit, what have you, it's often difficult. It may not even be there. But if you can somehow document it, certainly in those cases, we're open to considering them in the SIR calculation. We have seen, I know with lighting, for example, and I think I might have mentioned this, Brian, in the presentation, that you're theoretically going to save labor, clearly, but in actuality, we haven't seen real labor savings because the people are still there. It's not like you're going to be laying somebody off. But the bottom line is you've got to be able to document it. To me, that's the most difficult thing to do. But again, don't ignore it. If you can come up with some pretty good documentation, then that is something that certainly we would consider. So it's a good question.
Yeah, and this is Mackie. I will say, I mean, we've taken that stance. The statute does say that we need to look at just energy cost savings over the life of the measure. So, we're open to talking about it, but the statute is pretty clear in terms of that's what's guided us in terms of limiting it just to energy costs.
Okay, thank you. Building modeling. What building models have you found to be most common used for CPACE?
Well, the ones I've seen. I've only really seen two that have been used, but one is Trane's Trace 700 and Carrier's HA, the HAP model. The majority of projects certainly that have come to us have not used those models. They've used the more sophisticated spreadsheets using bin data and what have you. But those have been the most common, certainly, building simulation models.
Okay. What is the basis for using only a 3% electricity cost escalator?
Well, for the record, we looked at electricity costs in Connecticut back to 2000, and we looked at the compound annual growth rate for commercial electricity rates, and what it was 3.18%. By the way, for industrial rates, it was 3.19%. So we assumed 3% as a reasonable escalation rate. It was also consistent with ISO New England's assumed 20-year escalation rate. So we felt that that's a good number, and until we see differently or things change, right now that's what we're using.
Okay. Why are the cut sheets for equipment important?
Well, I think I mentioned that the cut sheets, they specify what equipment's being installed, and when we do the commissioning oversight, to support primarily the release of any contractor funds that might be held back, and maybe the last 10%, the cut sheets are referred to validate that what was sold was actually installed, and we also use them to corroborate some of the projected efficiencies of certain types of ECMs, on the HVAC side, that do have the HRI performance certificates attached to them.
Okay. Can you elaborate on the inverter, extended inverter warranty for solar PV projects over the financing term or the effective useful life?
Well, I can. I mean, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it during the presentation, but initially when we looked at the warranty or the inverter life, what we cared about was the financing term. Since that point in time, it's changed, and we can actually go now look at the savings over the full estimated useful life, which, as many of you know, for a solar system, would be as long as 25 years. But if you are going to use 25 years and take a credit for the savings over 25 years, then whatever you put in with respect to the inverters have to last that same period of time. So if you can get a warranty for 25 years, that's great. I'm not sure you're going to be able to do that, but if you can, certainly that would be fantastic. Whatever the cost would be, those would be included in your project. If you want to use the microinverters, that's your choice as well with an extended warranty. But again, the choice is yours, and we just like to make sure that whatever the savings, whatever term that the savings is going to be evaluated in the SIR calculation, that the warranty, that the inverters are going to last that long as well, that there's dollars in there if they have to be replaced.
I've been hearing about CPACE's Project Accelerator service. Can you tell me or provide more information?
That's I guess what I was referring to throughout the presentation on areas that we can help you on, whether it be templates, EULs, all those types of things. Under this Project Accelerated service, which is brand new, it's only started, I believe, a few months ago. Our staff engineers here at SRS would be available to assist you and provide technical support over the entire life of the project, working with you from building pre-qualification right through to project finance closing. We can help you with looking at savings, making sure that the full experience that we have with CPACE is available to you, with the whole goal of trying to accelerate development of these projects and getting them through the review process as quick as possible so we can get literally a project done in a much more expedited period of time. So again, there's no cost to you at this point in time. If you do need it, it is something that as soon as we're made aware of your project, we'll discuss that with you, and it's a matter of working out to make sure that you ask for it and that we'll be able to provide it to you.
Okay. What are you seeing on combining battery technology with solar PV systems?
That's a great question. I like that question. No question that battery technology is advancing at that fever state. I think most of your solar guys know that. The day will come when eventually energy storage with batteries, perhaps most likely with these more advanced batteries, and solar systems will get us away from some of that demand problem that we've been alluding to. Unfortunately, we do keep close tabs on this, clearly, and at least at this point in time, it's my professional opinion, and again, there may be some disagreement, but it's my professional opinion. It's just they're not economically justifiable at this time. I've looked at pricing. I try to keep tabs on pricing, and I see that battery storage technology, typically just as a relative indicator in that 300 to 500 per kilowatt hour range, which is about where these commercial lithium-ion batteries are today. They're at the upper end of that range. But to make economic sense, they're going to have to come down to less than $200 per kilowatt hour, preferably below $100. So I mean, there's a ways to go. There's a lot of technology on the horizon, which we're all waiting for, and to move into the commercial arena. So we'll have to kind of keep our tabs on it. Also, remember, it's not just cost; it's cost, and it's when you consider how much cycling has to get done. What's the lifetime? For example, you're not going to get, or it's going to be rare that I've even heard of lithium-ion battery warranties much more than 8 years old, in that ballpark. Remember, if you're going to put a solar PV system, you're going to need things to last 20 years, 25 years. So it may be different types of batteries, perhaps these new flow batteries, some other types of batteries that are out there that have a lot of potential. But again, they're still quite expensive. Some of the flow batteries I've seen that are moving into the commercial arena are something like $700 to $800 per kilowatt hour. So again, you can get a relative feel. It's still pretty expensive.
Okay. Why is it necessary to get fire marshal approval on rooftop solar systems?
Fire marshal, they now know that it's a firefighter safety concern. And as many of you know, and this is with these rooftop solar systems, they can interfere with being able to ventilate the roof, which is crucial and critical in the event of a fire. It can cause trip and slip concerns that the fire marshal has. So they're trying to address those things. They want to make sure that there's no potential shock hazard, what have you, for the firefighters. And I think the solar industry generally is beginning to recognize that. They're actually working with the firefighting community to kind of refine the codes and the standard operating procedures for firefighters what they have to do when they deal with these rooftop solar systems. I think you're going to see more and more of that as time goes on.
Okay. What ECMs do you see most often combined with solar PV systems to achieve a savings investment ratio greater than 1?
Probably the two most common that I've seen are the lighting upgrades and a boiler fuel switch conversion, converting from oil to natural gas. The relatively short payback periods combined with the solar system, even with a new roof, what have you, clearly can get that SIR greater than 1. And I think as time goes on, particularly with what the utility's done in reducing the generation size, more and more, you're going to see more and more of this. And so but those have been the most popular. Lighting is great. So clearly, if you're a solar guy, you should be taking a look at lighting as well.
Okay. And last one, energy on the line. Mackie spoke about this a little bit earlier, but could you provide a little bit more detail, maybe Mackie, on the recently launched CPACE Energy on the Line program?
Yep. So this is a partnership that the Green Bank has with the Manufacturing Innovation Fund and the Department of Economic and Community Development. They've provided funding, limited funding, to give to manufacturers that do a CPACE deal in order to help them boost their energy savings from the project by reducing the cost of the project. So we will give out up to $50,000 to manufacturers that do a CPACE project. It's somewhat complicated when we get to the amount, but it's basically the equivalent of reducing the interest rate by 1%, whatever the actual value of that reduction would be to the building owner. We just give them that amount up front. Again, as I mentioned, there's a limited funding for the program, so it's a first come, first served basis. So, you know, if you have some manufacturers in your pipeline or have some relationships there, you know, please go after them quickly so we can get those projects done before the funding runs out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of the team here at the Green Bank, and you can also go to energyontheline.com.
Okay. Thanks, Mackie. I think that's just about it. We started a couple minutes past the hour, so we're hitting the 1 hour mark. So thank you, everyone, for participating in today's program. By the close of business tomorrow, we'll distribute via email copies of the presentation deck as well as written responses to the Q&A, including questions that were not addressed during the webinar. We apologize if there are some that we didn't get to. This concludes our webinar session. As you log off the GoToWebinar screen, you will see a link to a quick 5-question evaluation form. We would greatly appreciate your evaluation of today's program. Thanks, everyone, again for your participation.